Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to call the meeting to order and start with the Pledge Allegiance of our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. While still standing, I'd like to call on our clerk.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. I'd like us to reflect and remember Everett Fisher, who died on January 5th. A longtime Greenwich resident, Everett was legal counsel with Fogarty, Cohen, Selby, and Nemiroff, and served on our Board of Estimate and Taxation for many years. He was very active in town. He also served on the town's retirement board and had positions with Greenwich Boys and Girls Club, the Union Trust Company, and the Round Hill Club, where he was a trustee for 55 years and president for many years. He was instrumental in the building of the Round Hill Community Church, where he served as trustee. So we'd like to ask for a moment of silence in the memory of someone who made a great deal of contributions to our town and our board. Thank you.
While still standing, it's very hard to represent this board on behalf of the losing of David Tice. I think our town showed up with 1,200 people on Saturday for the memorial. I don't think there's much I could say. Everybody in this town would love all of our government to act like David Tice and to be an upstanding citizen like he was. And we're all going to miss him, and I would ask everybody for a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Welcome guests, welcome members. Our next item on the agenda is our non-routine applications, and I will call on for FI2 Mr. Johnson for the Budget Committee.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I move FI2 for the fire department, amount of $457,080, release of conditions for overtime.
That item has been moved on behalf of the Budget Committee. Committee report, followed by discussion.
Mr. Chairman, the Budget Committee took this up last week. The fire administration with Chief Szynski and Assistant Chief Kick appeared before us, as well as Sandy Kornberg, head of the Volunteer Chiefs Association. They appeared before us to update on the progress towards an approval of a memorandum of understanding between the town's fire department and the volunteer fire companies. The purpose of this MOU is to promote a more positive working relationship between the two groups. The process started last winter. For the benefit of those who are unfamiliar, when the fire department presented plans for hiring up to 25 additional firefighters during the fiscal year 15 budgeting process, the BET had some questions on the utilization of and the working relationship with the volunteer firefighters and the town department. We conditioned the release of $1.8 million of overtime funds for the year based on quarterly reports from the two groups. At our meeting last week, all representatives agreed that strong progress had been made towards this memorandum of understanding, and they expect the MOU to be signed by all 7 volunteer fire companies, as well as career firefighter representatives in the town administration by April. So we did note that good progress has been made, and the groups appear to be working better together. The Budget Committee voted 4-0 to approve this motion.
Thank you. Discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? So I'm going to score that one, 11-0-1, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Blankley's abstaining. Okay. Next item is SE4, and I think I'm going to be calling on Mr. Raymer from the Law Committee for that one.
The Law Committee reviewed this with the attorney who is handling the matter, Abby Wadler, who, by the way, is here this evening. This was a review that we did not at our last meeting, but at our meeting last July. At the time of this meeting, we made a decision by a 2-0 vote to recommend settlement of this case at a figure slightly in excess of the $6,500 figure which is being requested today. With Attorney Wadler here in the room, I'm not going to take the board's time to summarize the case. I'll leave that for Mrs. Wadler to describe for you herself. Sorry.
Okay. Before I call it, wow. Are you suggesting that we need an executive session for?
I was just going to.
Somebody's got a microphone close to us. Are you going to be recommending?
Candidly, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to review the facts of the case, then I think it is appropriate that review and discussion take place in executive session. I'm sorry to make the meeting longer over what, in fact, is a small claim. Maybe members of the board feel differently.
Mr. Fenger?
Yeah, I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that maybe you poll the members of the board and ask if they need to have Abby review the facts of the case. Our packet did include a one-page explanation of this case and the other case that we'll be considering that I thought was very comprehensive. I personally wouldn't need any further explanation of what the case was about. But
Nor would I.
Agreed. And does anybody feel that we need anything on this?
In caucus, one of our members asked a related question, which I think was a fair question. It doesn't necessarily tie into the particular facts of the case, but I encourage that member to raise the question of Attorney Wadler here tonight. It doesn't matter which of these two cases it comes up in connection with. I think it would be appropriate that he have that opportunity. I'm talking about Mr. Goldrick.
But that need not be an executive session.
It does not need to be an executive session.
So discussion is open now, Mr. Goldrick.
Yeah, Ms. Wadler, if I could ask a question here. Excuse me. These seem to be kind of simple claims here. They happened 2 years ago. And I just wondered how much law department time went into this, or why this had been dragged out for 2 years. It seems that the fault is pretty well established, and I'm just curious about the process, because I guess a larger question is we seem to see a lot of lawsuits that seem rather cut and dried, but they come to the BET right before we're about to go to trial or something. And it just seems to me that maybe there should be a process whereby we're informed if the town has done something wrong, or we could take a shortcut here and go to a settlement earlier rather than fighting some of these lawsuits for years on end before we know we're going to settle. Now, that's not what this is, but maybe on these two cases you could enlighten us.
Yes. Well, there are two different explanations. One case, the Heverin matter is a lawsuit, and it was presented to committees last summer, but the Claims Committee did not approve it at that time. So I needed to go back to court, get a judge's recommendation, and then further negotiated that amount, and I'm going to be representing it to the Claims Committee tonight. So that's why that one was delayed. With Zuniga, the claimant, that's a claim, he had told KERMA, our investigating agency, that he was going to be putting this through his insurance company and we should deal with him, with them, but he never did that. So ultimately, it came back to us as a claim directly from him, and we decided to just take it from there.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? Okay, on SC4, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? 12-0-0. Mr. Raymer?
Mr. Chairman, on SE5, similarly, this was a matter that the Law Committee reviewed at its most recent meeting on the 13th of January, and we voted 2-0 to recommend settlement at the figure that's requested in the memorandum before you. And perhaps for the same reason, it might be the will of the board not to have executive session to discuss the facts.
Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Thank you. Mr. Johnson had his hand up first.
Mr. Chairman, given that our legal counsel is here in the room, I'd like to move that we move an item in the agenda. Under old business, we have approval of minutes of the special meeting of the BET, February 26, 2013. I move that we bring that item up in the agenda to right now.
Moved by Mr. Johnson to amend the agenda, seconded by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? While you're up, Mr. Fox, we're going to talk about this item, but while you're making your way up here, I would like to, from the BET, and I don't know if any other member would like to say hello to our new selectman, Mr. Toner. Welcome. Welcome to your first BET meeting as a selectman member.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Goldrick.
if I may, I had the opportunity to chat with Mr. Toner this afternoon and found out that we have a great deal in common. He has a set of parents who immigrated from Ireland. I have a set of grandparents. They both came here as teenagers, and his people were from Donegal and where in the north? Counties Rome, right. My people were from Roscommon and Cavan. To Irish Americans, they'll know the expression, his people. It'll sound familiar. We also served in the Peace Corps. Mr. Toner in Ghana, in the Volta region, teaching English, and I was working with tuberculosis patients in rural South Korea. I have a daughter who's in Africa, has been there for 3 years now. So it was very pleasant to get to know him, and I congratulate him on his accession to the Board of Selectmen and look forward to more pleasant chats in the future.
Again, welcome. It's great to have you here with us.
Mr. Chairman, a small point of order is brought to my attention by Mrs. Tarkington. She recalls correctly that I believe there was no actual motion before this board on SE5, and if the board would indulge me, I would make the motion that we approve SE5, and Mrs. Tarkington would second, and the minutes could so reflect.
Okay. If there's no objection, I'll enter that by unanimous consent. Thank you. Mr. Fox, we have this item on our agenda.
Yes, sir.
It goes back quite a ways. I've included in the package a draft of the minutes, and I've seen some communications going back and forth. Can you help us? Can you start us?
I certainly wanted to make myself available if anyone had any questions about it, just to give you a very brief history of what's involved. As I think you know, this goes back to a meeting of the BET back in February of 2013, which related to what I will call generically the MISA issues. That was held in executive session. I'm happy to take the responsibility for that. That was my recommendation, that it belonged in executive session. A complaint was filed by the Greenwich Times with respect to whether or not it ought to be an executive session and whether or not it constituted a claim. It was my opinion then, it is still my opinion, that it was a valid claim for a number of reasons. Be that as it may, we had that hearing before the Freedom of Information Commission, and it ruled against us. In conjunction with there, and again upon my recommendation, we took an appeal with the approval of the Board of Selectmen to the Superior Court, which is our right under the statute. There were two aspects of the decision of the Freedom of Information Commission that I felt were inappropriate, one being, quite frankly, much more important than the other. And they specifically set this out in their decision. They indicated that an entity such as the BET, although it would also apply to the Board of Selectmen, it would also apply to the Board of Education, would not and could not meet in executive session unless they were actually named a defendant in litigation. It is my opinion that that was not the intent of the statute. It was not the legislative history of the statute. And it would impose a terrible burden on an entity such as the town of Greenwich or any other municipality throughout the state of Connecticut. That was the primary reason for taking the appeal. That precedent was very important. The second aspect was whether or not it simply constituted a claim or not. It was and is my opinion that if anyone files a statement, a letter, which wants a particular job shut down, if someone files a complaint with an agency of the state or federal government, all of which happened in this case, that constitutes a claim. Be that as it may, the Superior Court ruled, I'm happy to say, in our favor with respect to this entity being effectively the town under the statute and having the right to go into executive session. Had it been any other finding, then it would mean if we were here, such as this evening, to discuss a negligence case, then we would not have the right to go into executive session because your board is not, and in my experience, rarely, if ever, is named as a party. Be that as it may, we were satisfied with that result. The second aspect of it was whether or not it was a claim, and the Superior Court found that it was not a claim. From my perspective, it may be an interesting issue to pursue an intellectual debate that could be held. It is my experience and belief that on freedom of information claims, it is rare that you are successful at the commission level. It is rare that you are successful at the Superior Court level. You are more likely to be successful, as we have seen in cases that have come down over the last several years from our appellate court and from our Supreme Court. You are more likely to be successful on a policy issue at that level, or you are successful in the legislature. Be that as it may, I discussed this with the Board of Selectmen. The Board of Selectmen has the authority to make that decision. I do not quibble. I do not disagree with their decision in terms of what we achieved compared to the time, money, and effort to go the second step and argue a case in the appellate court and quite likely in the Supreme Court in terms of what the result would be compared to what we were ordered to do, which was simply to file minutes, the three boards that were involved to file minutes, and to provide the newspaper with some documentation, which we have already done, and which, quite frankly, was made public in a public hearing held by the Board of Education several weeks after that, so there weren't any secrets being told out of school. We provided subsequently all that information, but we were in executive session, in my opinion, to discuss strategy and the approach to take. So the decision was made by the Board of Selectmen, which I do not disagree with and I do agree with, not to pursue it any further, and we didn't. In conjunction with the order entered by the Commission, we are now going back to, we've been to the Board of Selectmen, it has approved minutes. It's to your board. It will be to the Board of Education, I believe, later this week for approval of minutes. That's all that you are being asked to do this evening. I have seen emails from Jeff Framer. I've seen emails from Mary Lee Kieran. I don't quibble over those suggested changes. In some ways, it's a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. I mean, were we there to discuss strategy, or were we there to discuss claims? It was all part of the same discussion. There were claims that were made. There were agencies that were brought in which would not otherwise have been involved in this process at all had it not been for Mr. Efros. Be that as it may, I do not object, nor is it for me to object, it's for you to decide. I do not object to the suggestions that Jeff made, if the others are willing to accept that, nor do I object to the rather minor suggestions to name individuals that Mary Lee suggested. So with your approval, I would ask that the minutes that you are comfortable with be approved so that I can forward them on to the newspaper.
Okay. So just very quickly on process, does everybody understands that? So we know what we're doing here. So with that, obviously I have a draft that's stamped subject to approval in your package for the month. And I have seen the email traffic, and I do appreciate it. I mean, it's always fantastic when we're talking. I will say that this draft, I will consider this draft before us and then accept amendments.
Well, to put the thing before the body, although I'm going to propose an amendment in a
Correct.
moment, let me make a motion that that the board approve the minutes that were proposed, and then there's the second. Before there's a vote, there'll be various motions to amend. But I think by way of procedure, somebody has to move this to put it before the board. So I'm moving the draft to put it before the board.
Okay.
And
Second.
second.
Okay, so the item is now before us, and I will accept motions or handout, whatever.
Mr. Chairman?
One second. I know we have two. Ms. Kieran, you want to go first?
Sure. Was there discussion? Are you inviting discussion, or inviting amendments?
Either way.
I wonder if I could, before we get to the amendments, something on this particular memo, minutes. You know, I'm very troubled by the entire process, but I don't think that this proposed minutes really gets to the truth. It says that we met to go into executive session to discuss a pending claim. And then the next paragraph, the committee discussed pending claims. But really, that's not what happened. We met in order to be presented with or given a presentation by AECom with 3 different options for us to consider. And unfortunately, in executive session, we considered those options and basically came to, if not, I don't think we voted on anything, but what was going to be the option we would take going forward. Mr. Efros has continually put out as sort of a bogeyman here, but I don't think it's fair, really. I think the essence of that meeting, the entire meeting, was the AECom presentation. I think we should have said at some point, one of John Blankley in our caucus asked, did anyone say when we realized this wasn't about a pending claim, we should get out of executive session? And unfortunately, we didn't. We should have. The next morning, Greenwich Time published an article which was maybe 2/3 right. The irony of this is that entire presentation was made to the general public about 2 weeks later. So I would like to, start anew with a more forthcoming minutes proposal here, rather than make amendments to this.
Okay, do you have anything you'd like to offer?
I have to say that because of illness and computer problems, I only saw this fairly recently. So I might be in favor of putting this off and maybe having the BET compose a draft of its own, rather than going from this and adding suggestions.
Are you making a motion to postpone this item?
I may make that in a few minutes' time, when we have had a chance to discuss this.
Okay. Mr. Finger?
Just to respond to Mr. Goldrick's comments, I think many people on this board have expressed an interest in expanding upon the language in this draft set of amendments, set of minutes, and as indicated and prefaced by comments by Mr. Fox. He acknowledged and has received comments and is receptive to those changes. He knows, and we all know what those changes are. It's been discussed in email traffic and in other forums. The fact of the matter is, counsel advised us there was a claim. We went into executive session. The vote was unanimous to go into executive session, so I don't think we need to go revisit what the reason was we went into executive session. We had explained to us by Mr. Fox the legal thought process behind the appeal or non-appeal, and I think we should move forward. There are going to be motions, as everybody on this dais is aware. There will be a motion made by Mr. Raymer and by Ms. Kiernan and maybe others to expand upon this draft set of minutes. So this draft set of minutes is just in front of us so that we can make amendments and add the information that Mr. Goldrick was alluding to. So my feeling, I would vote against the postponement because there's no need to postpone something that we've all had an opportunity to discuss for quite some time. So I would look forward to receiving formally the proposed amendments by Ms. Kiernan and Mr. Raymer that have been distributed to everybody.
Okay. Ms. Kiernan?
I'm happy to start making the amendment motions if you are.
I by the way, I saw your memo, and I actually laughed because it was who seconded it, and it was, I just couldn't remember.
It was in the first draft, which was
Yes.
given to us in the packet conveniently. So just as a preface, I'll make three motions that really just make consistent the language in the new draft with the language in the old draft, and identifies the movement and seconder for the three motions that were made in connection with that meeting.
No,
And I'll-
go ahead.
I'll specifically state them.
Please, please.
No, that seems fine, just to be sure that we adequately record what you're proposing.
Aha,
Can,
yes.
you got them in writing, then we can share them with Catherine? That's great. Thank you, Ms.
And
Karen.
I just released my caucus. If there's anyone else that would like these in writing, I can distribute them now.
Sure, if you got one.
Please.
Okay, here's 5 more coming that way for those who are not in my caucus. Mr. Chairman, the first amendment, I would move to replace the first motion paragraph, which is located on page 1 under the list of attendees.
Microphone.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would move to replace the first motion paragraph located on page 1 below the list of attendees with the following language, which is, upon a motion by Mr. Raymer, seconded by Ms. Tarkington, the board voted 11-0-0 to go into executive session at 6:05 p.m. for the purpose of discussing a pending claim related to the elimination of contamination on the Greenwich High School MESA site. And Mr. Fox, that of course takes your language for identification of the claim.
That's fine.
Okay,
You want to hear all three?
yeah.
Okay.
I-
The second motion, I would move to replace the paragraph on page 2, which is the second to last paragraph, with the following language. Upon a motion by Ms. Kiernan, seconded by Mr. Norton, the board voted 11-0-0 to come out of executive session at 7:23 p.m.
Second.
And I would move to replace the final paragraph on page 2 with the following language. Upon a motion by Mr. Norton, seconded by Mr. Raymer, the board voted 11-0-0 to adjourn at 7:24 p.m.
Thank you very, very much. We have 3 motions that have been moved and seconded. Unless anybody has a reason to, I will call for the vote on those as combined, all one amendment, even though they've been seconded separately. Discussion? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Now,
One abstention, Mr. Blankley, who was not present.
all right, so we have, all right, slow down for a second here. We have to have 3 abstentions, I think.
Right.
So the vote on this item, am I correct, is 9-0-3. And the reasons for the abstention is?
We want that.
They weren't there. Okay. Okay, that takes care of that. Okay, Mr. Raymer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a group of changes, but I think they could be made subject of a single motion and a single vote. I direct the board's attention to the bottom of page 1 of the draft minutes, the paragraph that presently reads, "The committee discussed pending claims." And I'm going to move that the words, starting with having, the words having been brought to various agencies by William F. Rose, including claims filed with, that those words be deleted and be replaced with the single word before. Then I'm going to propose a second change, and that is the insertion at the end of that sentence of a new sentence to become the second sentence of that paragraph. And that sentence reads, "There was mention also of related claims recently filed against the town by Mr. William F. Rose." The rest of the paragraph remains intact. Then on the second page, there is presently a sentence which starts, it's a paragraph, a 3-sentence paragraph, and it starts, "Various maps were presented." I would replace that paragraph with a new paragraph that reads as follows. "A map showing initial test results was presented. AECOM and Environmental Council suggested preliminarily that there may be generally 3 levels of option available to the town, A, a relatively thin cap of clean soil to achieve basic compliance at a cost of perhaps $7 million, but which would likely require fairly severe limits on the use of the site, including preclusion of its use for athletic fields. B, at the other extreme, the complete removal of virtually all of the affected soil, or all soil to a relatively great depth of 10 or 15 feet, which might entail a cost in excess of $100 million, but which would allow for very broad future uses of the site, but always with EPA and DEEP supervision. Or C, a middle ground of clean fill to depths calibrated to allow use of the fields for athletic purposes at a cost of perhaps $17 million, but which would have material further compliance issues in the event of future excavations at the athletic fields. That paragraph would replace the paragraph that I referred to. I am moving those changes, Mr. Chairman, if there's a second.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, should I just put my hand up? First?
Yeah. Are you seconding it?
No.
Second.
Oh, I'm looking for a second first. Seconded by Ms. Kiernan. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Goldrick, Mr. Finger.
Could Mr. Raymer read that first paragraph as corrected, so I know exactly how this is going to read? First one you made. The First Amendment. You said, I think the committee discussed pending claims from there.
The first change, Mr. Goldrick, just to repeat if I may, if you look at the draft minutes at the bottom paragraph that presently begins, the committee discussed, I'm deleting the words, if you look at that first sentence, having been brought to various agencies by William Efros, including claims filed with. And I put there instead just the word before.
So this should read, the committee
discussed pending claims before the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency, among others. And then I add a sentence, Mr. Goldrick, to pick up on the subject of Mr. Efros. And the sentence that I add reads, there was mention also of related claims recently filed against the town by Mr. William Efros. And then the rest of the paragraph goes on unchanged.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, the problem I have, going back 2 years or whenever this was, is that I recall that there was minimal discussion of the claims themselves or of any claim. I know that we showed up in good faith believing that that was the reason, but basically we were there for a presentation by AECOM. So the notion that we discussed these claims, where that was somehow the primary objective of the meeting, I don't think was accurate. Maybe others can search their memories.
I think AECOM was there to tell you what the options are of the claim. But okay, Mr. Finger.
Just to help Mr. Goldrick, I think the language that Mr. Raymer is discussing here, proposing, particularly that second paragraph, he's not limiting what was discussed or what wasn't discussed. He is saying the committee discussed pending claims before the various departments. There was a mention of a recently filed claim by Mr. Efros. That was my recollection. Then Mr. Raymer, in the second part of his proposed motion, went into more detail as to what was discussed in the presentation by AECOM. So that is my recollection, although I would like to make a motion to amend Mr. Raymer's motion to amend by adding at the end of the that lengthy paragraph on the AECOM presentation an additional sentence, that being estimated timeframes to complete each option were discussed.
Okay.
Second that.
I'm going to ask you, because that doesn't delete anything. Let's deal with Mr. Raymer's, and then you can add a motion to that, because that add wouldn't be any different than than Mr. Ramers. Mr. Ramers, we could vote on his item. If that passes and you want to add that, then
That's fine, okay.
it's just probably a little cleaner that way.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
In the normal passage of things, normally when there's a motion to amend the amendment is in order, and usually that's dealt with before you vote on the First Amendment. I mean, I suppose it can be done in any way the chair likes.
I wish you had a written handout. I'm trying to
Okay.
digest. I don't want to do too many changes at one time because we're drafting on the fly here.
Okay, all right.
That was my
I'm
thought there.
fine with having Mr. Ramers, and then I'll make mine.
Correct. This way we're very clear where we're at. Okay, on Mr. Ramers' motion, discussion. Okay, on Mr. Ramers, we'll do Mr. Fingers next.
I
Okay.
have just one more comment. I think the point is that this still gives the impression that we were there and that this presentation was motivated by some lawsuit, which it wasn't. We had to remediate that site. We weren't doing this because, in executive session, because of strategy concerns. And I think that's the point, is that we made a mistake. That should have been, at that point, a public meeting with everybody seeing those options, rather than, I think my point here is that we shouldn't continue with the fiction that it was because of a lawsuit or strategy in light of a lawsuit.
Point of order, I'd ask that we have the motion, there's a motion to amend on the table. If Mr. Goldrick wants to further amend the minutes, he has the right to do that, but let's vote on this one.
Okay, so on Mr. Ramers, I'd like to make a comment on, I genuinely remember three options, but I think the idea was we were there to discuss what options would be viable to the state, rather than the state coming down and not giving us an option and addressing the issue for us. I think that was my number one concern when I went to that meeting, that the town has an obligation here, and if we don't do it, the state could step in and do it for us. I think that was number one concern. Where that actually came in the minutes, I'm not really sure, but I can tell you I recall that thought. So, again, Mr. Ramers' motion has been moved, seconded. If there's no further discussion, I'll call for the vote on Mr. Ramers. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so, all right, so what do we have here?
So that's 8.
And abstentions?
8-1-3.
Well, so it's, yes. Okay. Mr. Finger, you have a motion to amend?
I'd like to make a motion to amend by adding at the end of that the second paragraph on page 2, which has just been amended, I'd like to add the sentence, estimated timeframes to complete each option were discussed. Were discussed. Oh,
Okay. Okay, Mr. Finger?
I second that.
Okay, motion by Mr. Finger, seconded by Mr. Raymer. Just 1 second, the last vote was not 8-1-3, it was 7-2-3.
who were the two?
Mr. Norton and Mr. Goldrick were negative. Obviously, the same three are abstaining because they weren't here.
Okay, but wouldn't it be 6-2-3 because there's only 11 people at that meeting? Or,
No, but there's
I'm sorry, there's 12 here. Never
there's
mind.
12 here
I'm
tonight.
sorry.
Yeah, but they can't vote.
Right, okay.
There's 3.
Okay, so we have a motion and seconded. Discussion. All those in favor of Mr. Finger's amendment?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so that one is going to be, and 3 abstentions, obviously. No, that one is going to be 8-1-3.
Was there an opposition?
Yes, Mr. Norton voted against that.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. I'm going to ask on these minutes when they get revised, can you get me a copy, or get us a copy, and obviously Mr. Fox a copy, so we can read through this? As you know, I've never been a fan of this board writing sort of in this condition, so I just want to make sure it all comes out right. Mr. Fingers?
I just wonder whether Mr. Goldrick now wanted to make a motion.
Yes, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Goldrick, you have a motion?
Yes, at the beginning of the paragraph where it says, "It was noted that the information here," I would like to eliminate that sentence and substitute, Mr. Goldrick asked the presenters when this information would be made public. Amy Siebert responded that the presentation would be made to the public at a presentation in about 2 weeks.
Wait for a minute.
Okay.
May it be a second.
Okay, can you, all right, this is the last paragraph before a motion to come out of executive session. And you want to say Mr. Goldrick can you just repeat that for me for one more second?
Sure.
This is for me, not anybody else. I'm just...
Mr. Goldrick asked the presenters when this information would be made public. Amy Siebert responded that the presentation would be made to the general public within 2 weeks.
Okay. Okay. Do I have a second? Okay. That motion does not have a second. Okay. So that brings us back to the minutes as been amended.
Should we do it now? Do you
Ms.
want me to do it now? Mr. Fox, I didn't email you, but I did discuss it with a couple members of the board. Between the different versions, Mr. Tice's name had been removed, but Mr. Tice, although obviously sadly is no longer with us, did attend that meeting.
So let's make a motion to amend.
So I move that we add Mr. Tice's name back to the list of selectmen.
I would second that motion.
Okay, we have a...
Respect, at the meeting that minutes were approved by the Board of Selectmen, Mr. Tice was at that Board of Selectmen meeting just recently and confirmed for others that he was not at that meeting. So that's why his name was removed. That's my recollection.
No, you go ahead.
I just point out, I mean, I specifically recall Mr. Tice being at the meeting, and in fact, Mr. Mason had included in our packet the minutes of the regular BET meeting, which noted that the first selectman and both selectmen were in attendance. So I think it's consistent.
It's your minutes, so if you wish to do that.
Actually,
it's not for me to
I
say something.
actually attended that selectmen's meeting. I don't attend very many. And I heard him, and I was surprised because Mr. Tice did come in a little late, but he actually sat next to me.
I think that's really what the gist is. I think Selectman Tice came in late. So I don't think he was there for the whole, because that's really all we did, and we were only an hour and 18 minutes doing this, and I do recall him coming in late. So that's probably why he is saying, look, I'm not, I wasn't there. So you can, when Ms. Tarkington revises her motion to say David Tice, selectman, late, I don't know what time he got there, just as a footnote.
It wasn't too late, but I just think we don't put timing on any of our.
We actually do. If a member leaves early or something like that, we do that, and we've done that in the past.
Okay. So you would suggest I would amend it to say late?
Yeah. Because
Then
I know he wasn't there at the start of the meeting.
That's correct. He did come in late. So I would propose to amend what I said and in parentheses, late.
And as the seconder, I adopt that change.
Okay. Okay, further discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Goldrick?
Yeah, I note that I didn't get a second on my amendment here, but I will note that that is a fact. I did most assuredly ask whether that information, that presentation would all be made available to the public, because at that point in the meeting, I was becoming uncomfortable.
Okay, I would say, I think everybody's heard you. Does anybody want to reconsider their second?
Motion on the table.
The motion's on the table, Mr. Goldrick.
Well, you asked for discussion, so
On the motion that's on the table. Your motion didn't get a second. Okay. So I'm going to call this the Ms. Tarkington motion. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? So I'm going to call that one 903. Okay. Mr. Fox, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking me out of order as I have a Claims Committee meeting also this evening.
Okay.
Anybody you want to hire from that, given this recent discussion, that can assist you in the legal department?
We will take whatever help we can get. Thank you.
Okay, back to our agenda. Item number 4. I'm sorry for that.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and fellow members.
Mr. Chairman, there's a question here from the side of the table.
Just a quick question. You amended it. Don't you have to vote on the item
Oh, I'm
as
sorry.
amended?
I'm sorry. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to label this the minutes for the special meeting of the Board of Estimate Taxation held on Tuesday, February 26, 2013, in the Comb Room, Greenwich, Connecticut, as amended. Okay, we'll call that's the title. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining. So, opposed. Oh, okay, so that means, let's try this again. So that's 4 abstentions, 1, and 7. 7, 1, 4. Okay, that carries.
Mr. Chairman? And sorry, just to know who the
Huffman?
one was?
Mr. Huffman voted against it?
Yep, thanks.
No, Mr. Huffman abstained.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Goldrick voted against.
Mr. Goldrick voted in the negative, and Mr. Huffman abstained.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to indicate that I voted to support the amended version of these minutes, even though I was opposed to any changes to those were proposed, because I think the changes don't accomplish anything in the minutes that were presented.
Thank you. Okay. Number 4, assessor's report. Let's take 2.
Minutes should reflect that the assessor was on time, but that makes
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and fellow members of the BET. I would like to present the assessor's report for January 2015. First of all, the 2014 grand list has been completed. I shall be signing the grand list next week. We will be sending out all increase notices to be mailed by the end of this week, and taxpayers will have until February 20th in which to file to the Board of Assessment Appeals. So the 2014 list is done, and we will submit numbers to everybody next week. February 1st, the filing period for the senior programs begin. We shall be notifying all the seniors who need to apply this year. The application period for the seniors is February 1st to May 15th. And finally, the 2015 revaluation. We are starting it, finally.
You look excited.
Yes, I am. We are still waiting to sign one contract. We have awarded one contract to the commercial and condo part. We are still waiting to award and sign the contract for the residential portion of the 2015 revaluation. But my office has already started preparing for this task for next year, for this year. Anybody have any questions?
Go ahead, Mr. Frum.
I have 2 points. First off, I see on litigation settlements we're kind of stuck in
stalled.
Stuck in
Yes.
neutral.
We have some in the works. We're coming. We'll
But for the last couple of months,
Yes.
we've been stuck at the same place. My question has to do, explain to me the benefits of having 2 contractors to prepare the reassessment.
Well, basically what we did is we separated the contract out this time. We had the commercial and the residential portions of that. And that gave us the ability to go and get the best for both parts. So we actually have, I think, probably one of the best commercial appraisers and revaluation companies. They have a very small staff, so they didn't have the capacity in which to do the residential side of it. The residential side, we actually picked a larger company. We picked Tyler, who just completed the residential revaluation in 2013 in Darien. So they're somewhat better on doing the residential. So we figured also by spreading it out a bit, we are a little under some time constraints. It will also help us get this job done on a timely fashion. We'll have more people working on it.
Will they work together or will they work in parallel?
I will be responsible for putting all of it together, so to speak. But yes, they will be working on their own separate parts, but in conjunction. I'm basically going to oversee this whole project, so we'll make sure it all fits.
So each one of these firms will basically working independently of each other and working really in parallel. Yeah, I understand that, but how their methodology of working and completing the project, because I think this is the first time, at least in the years that I've been familiar with the process, that we have split it.
Yes. It has been done in other municipalities.
But not in Greenwich.
But not in Greenwich, right.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that question, common denominator? I mean, so both groups will have kind of the same input, obviously, from your office. The way they value some of the different, so, I mean, you're not concerned that one's going to be looking at it from an apples and the other one from an oranges standpoint? It's,
No, we're going to make sure, I have revaluation experience myself. We're going to make sure that these pieces all fit together and it makes some sense.
Great. I just have one other question, kind of a general question. In the paper yesterday or today, there was an article about some of the commercial properties and the appraisals, I'm assuming from banks or whatever, that based on vacancy rates. If the vacancy rate grows, it's going to go down in value. Does your office look at that at all when you do a reevaluation? You look at the vacancy rate, which can only maybe a short period of time. Hopefully they'll get a large tenant, but does that affect the overall appraisal from the town standpoint?
It does, but we also are looking, when we look at those buildings, we're asking them, we look at a stabilized vacancy rate. And it's because some of our larger office buildings were single tenant, they have a vacancy rate that's much higher than the overall market. So we're going to be looking at that and determine whether or not these are vacancies that are, that each building may have for a long term, or we're also going to see whether or not it's just a short term problem for some of these properties. But we are going to look back quite a bit and as far as and stabilize those properties so that we're not just looking at one quick picture. In other words, if they were all vacant as of October 1st, 2015, does that mean we use that vacancy rate? No. Yeah. So we're going to be looking at the overall office market as well.
So if a building does have a large, single tenant and they happen to be vacant at the time of the new reevaluation, and then all of a sudden they get a large tenant, that would trigger a re-evaluation again, wouldn't it?
I'm only allowed to look at these properties
once every 5 years.
Once every 5 years.
Okay.
But we're going to say that if an office building is totally vacant as of an assessment date, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to say that it's vacant.
It might have been full the day before.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions. Your calendar, do we post this anywhere? Is this where people? Is this something people need to see? I mean, I know when we do the
Assessment calendar.
the revaluation calendar. I'm sorry. Do we post that somewhere? So, because I remember there's articles in the paper. Hey, the town's doing the revaluations, and
we'll put out press releases. Okay. But I just wanted to make sure we get. I don't want to jump the gun here.
Okay. Yeah. The other question is, you mentioned the senior tax. That's a resolution that we have. Is that still in effect?
Yes.
We did that for 2 years.
Yeah.
No, we did it until June 2019.
Yeah, you're okay.
Just checking. Thank you.
I'll add an additional comment here. The year-over-year increase in value, it's based on the median price of homes in town, and went up approximately, I think, 5%. So that will be a benefit to seniors because many of them who apply for this program, there's income levels, and so this will just really raise the ceiling for them.
So more will be able to file for it.
More should be able to file if they're eligible in income and other things.
Got it. And Mr. Finger, Ms. Tarkington, I know you have the assessor's office is your bailiwick, so I know you're going to be busy, and they need to just keep them busy, keep giving them assignments.
We have our calendars marked. We typically meet generally once a month, and we're going to be meeting once every other week, and more frequently if needed.
May I just add to the earlier question about the RFP for the revaluation? We have a very large portfolio, and every firm has to be registered and certified by the state, and the state has a very detailed, we'll call it a manual on how you do the process. But this was also bid out for any firm to bid on the whole revaluation, or, as Lauren has pointed out, how in the end the committee that was selecting you could also bid individually on the residential or the commercial. So there were multiple options any bidder could choose when he presented his proposals. He could really present, I guess, up to 3 proposals, one for the full, one for the residential, one for the commercial.
Okay, anything else? Okay, can I get a motion to accept the assessor's report for somewhere over there? They all. Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? Thank you. Mr. Minarski, good evening. Controller's report.
Good evening. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. As you all know, we went to market last week, and I'll start out talking about the financing. I had a conversation with Sean Goldrick this afternoon, and it's relative to the financing. He was talking about an article that he had read upstate about how the state of Connecticut handles their premiums and in a somewhat controversial way. And I had told Sean, well, first Sean said he was going to ask me this question, so he's already asked it, and I said I would report on it. We don't handle it the same way as the state. And I says, I actually, in my revenue presentation each year, talk about this. So to answer Sean's question and to jump the gun a little bit, I'm going to give you page 21, which I handed out, is the revenue presentation, which is relative to the financing last week. And it's actually, it's good we talk about it because it's one of the highlights of the financing. And let me see if I can just show you the sample. Everybody see it in front of them? Okay, this is the revenue presentation from last year, and it'll be updated for February. And Mark's going to talk a little bit about the calendar. The premiums in the first year of 10-11, if you multiply the 534 times 5, that was the premium we got on that first bond issue when we went to market. And what we do, unlike the state of Connecticut, is we amortize it over the life of the bond. This is the general fund piece, not the sewer piece, this 534. So the 534 is embedded in each of these 5 years. And then in the second year, in 11-12, we have the second bond issue, and we have the second premium. And the incremental difference is, if you multiply 9 and 5, it comes out to 2.5 million, rounded off. The amortization takes place over 5 years. So we have 5 years here, and when you look at the $1,906,000 in year 14-15, it's got 5 bond issues. So the 534 in the presentation I'm going to give you next month is going to fall off. And I also sent out the results of the 5-year and the 20-year rates for the bonds lot, the $40 million bond issue. Mr. Finger and Mr. Goldrick both asked that question, and the answer is, in that case, the 20-year was 2.35 and the 5-year was 0.75. What one of the highlights is the premium on the general fund was $4,042,000 and change. So when you see the presentation next month, the number is going to be approximately 2.2 million, I believe it is. So we're picking up, actually, in the budget process. We're dropping off about 534, and we're picking up about $800,000. So that's simply how we amortize the premium on the bonds, and it's treated as a revenue in the presentation, in the budget presentations. So again, we had a very good offering. We had a blended rate of 1.42. As I said, 75 basis points for the 5-year and 2.35 for the 20-year, and we maintained our AAA, and it was pretty easy process.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And any questions on the? Yes. Really. Thank you.
Congratulations, and thank you for all your hard work on this. And you and I were emailing a bit about the premium today, so that the premium on the general obligation bonds was about $4.2 million. Is that right?
$4,042,644.
Great. And on the bands, was there a premium at all?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't have it in front of me. The
4,000.
How much?
204,000. Is that on the chart?
I'm talking about the bands.
The bands were there was the low bidder only bid on 40 million. Mm-hmm. It was a couple $100,000, I believe, on the premium on the bands. I can answer this. The second 40 million had a 5% coupon, and it was $3.3 or $3.4 million premium. So it was a very large premium, right, based on that, the way they bid on that. I can get that number exactly. I'll send it to Did I not send the bands to
You sent me
everybody?
the parity sheets,
Yeah.
Pete.
Okay,
and
but I can get that number
okay,
for you.
Great. And then the second question, Pete, was just something I've asked about before and want to clarify. The transaction costs associated with the offering, are roughly, I know those bills don't come in for a while.
Okay,
But
the transaction cost for last year for the 45 million general obligation bonds and 85 million bands was $167,000.
Okay.
That's the bond counsel, Robinson & Cole, bills you separately for the 45 million bonds and the 85 million bands. IBIC, who we also is in the process of, we're doing an RFP because his contract is up, bids $18,000 per contract, and that'll be negotiated with the new contract. Then there's the cost for the Fitch, Moody's, and the S&P. The bond buyer cost, the total is $167,000, and I'm estimating it's going to be slightly higher, about $175,000, and the discount, the underwriter's discount, it was $20,000 and change. I can't remember exactly.
on the bonds.
And then on the bonds, yeah.
On the bonds, and then like 4,000 on the bands.
And yeah, it was two pieces. There was 400 and 3,600.
Right.
3,600 was on the bands with the second 40 million.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you. So when you ran through the figures for last year, the $167,000 of total transaction costs was on total borrowings of $100 million, or what was it?
130 million, 45 and 85.
130 million. So that's like a basis point and a quarter, right? That's very, very small, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sean has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Gover.
Yeah, how much was the fee for those three ratings by the three agencies?
I could actually send you the whole itemized breakdown of the 167.
Well, no, I'm just saying,
That's
interested in those three.
That's included in the
It's
167?
in the 167.
Oh, well, it's about $25,000 each, right?
They're different. They're dramatically different.
Really?
Yeah.
The reason I bring this up is because I've noted that we're one of the very few municipalities in Connecticut that actually has all three major rating agencies do a rating. Most do one or two. And we could possibly be saving a chunk of money each year if we went down to two instead of three. You know, do we really need Fitch in there if we have Moody's and Standard & Poor's?
This came up 5 or 6 years ago. I know. You want to go first?
It did come up, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, basically when we still had negative fund balance and there were some issues then.
Yes,
but I think
exactly.
Sean makes a very good point. I mean, I think maybe the necessity for having all three has outlived its usefulness, and I think Sean makes a good point that we should look at the possibility of at least reducing it from 3 to 2, and I'll leave it to others to decide which of the two are most appropriate.
No, we could. That's a good point. And to both of you, yes, we could peel off one of them. Because it's
Chairman,
one of them.
I'd like to address that issue.
It was back then. We basically, even though we had under 2003, the last time we went to market was 2003. At that point, for the North Mianus Millbrook issue, we had an existing AAA. But when the theory was we wanted to go to market. To Bill's point, we had a negative fund balance, and we wanted to get the AAAs from both of them, from all three of them, moving forward. And Bill Kelly. He was the one that originally wanted to, and I think Art's going to talk about that. So I think the time is now. It has outlived its usefulness, and we don't necessarily need all three.
I'm going to talk against it because I don't think we can quantify the intangible benefits we get from having AAA ratings from S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. They all serve different markets and different environments, and I think it's extremely difficult to be able to quantify, and you can probably identify a portion of the low interest rates as a result of the fact that all three rating agencies give us AAA ratings and the language that they include in their reports.
Ms. Weisler?
I would support Sean's at least suggestion that we look at it. I actually was just looking at an article today, and Fitch, I guess, has a 20 to 30% market share, I guess, in terms of municipal ratings. S&P is about 80, and I think Moody's is slightly less than that. So it's a question, of the incremental value I think that we should look at for the cost of what we're paying at Fitch.
And Mr. Chairman, if I will, once not long ago, I went back and looked at as Ms. Kiernan brought up, the cost of issuance versus the interest, the net interest we were paying, and they were almost equal or very close. So, in fact, this is a major portion of the expense, and especially in a very low interest rate environment like this, if you add those in, those are major expenses, not the interest itself.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just one final layer on that. Roland had given me some numbers on these costs going back a couple of years. So as Mr. Minarski mentioned, it was $167,000 January of 14. January of 13, it was $128,000. January of 12, those costs were $115,000. So they've ramped up a bit in the last 3 years.
Okay, continuing, Peter.
Any other questions in the controller's report?
I'll entertain a motion that we accept the controller's report for January 2015. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining?
Just a quick question for Pete. Pete, you do refer to the Nathaniel Witherall tax credit of $4.5 million. Any indication for this coming fiscal year if there's additional? That refers to the fiscal year 15 that we put in the budget last year, right?
As far as getting the $4,490,000?
Additional tax credits.
I don't see any reason why we shouldn't get it by June 30th. They're waiting for this.
Will there be some more on top of that 4.5? Do you have any idea yet?
No. Not on the tax credits, but there's some other small grants that they're working on.
Yeah.
One is the steep grant, which they told you about, the $500,000, and I think there was an energy grant.
The steep grant, the way in which the steep grants work is you have to have projects approved and you get reimbursed for the expenditures. So they're not truly grants, at least not in the sense of the other grants. We're getting grants also for electricity, some of the equipment that's been installed in the reduced electricity. Those are grants, but the steep I don't believe is a grant because it's all the reimbursement. We're allocated up to $500,000 on a steep grant. If we don't spend the $500,000, that's all we get. We get exactly what it spends. So the $500,000 could be $200,000 at the end of the day.
Okay.
At the end of the
But to answer your question, no, we're I think it's capped at 4.5, isn't it?
It's capped at whatever the number is here. However, we're still waiting for planning and zoning to sign off on the certificate of occupancy to be able to sell the tax credits. That has not happened as of today.
Okay. All those in favor of the... Oh, we already did that. I'm sorry. Item number 6, Treasurer's Report. I have a motion by Mr. Norton. Do I have a second? Second. Seconded by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstaining? That motion has passed. Our next item, item 7, you have an audit committee meeting for January 15th. That item is postponed for tonight. I know it's in your package, but I was trying to get the package out early because of the minutes and whatever, and the committee hasn't agreed on that yet, so that item is postponed for tonight. And we'll get back to that at our next meeting.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. So you're withdrawing the report that was distributed to us?
Yes.
Okay.
That brings us, if I turn the page, that brings us to item 9. Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. My report is included. MISA's now approximately 60% complete, a little bit more than that. The building has been closed in for winter conditions, at least on a temporary basis, and we'll have a tour for BET members to update them. It's been, I guess, since the end of last July, since people have had the opportunity to walk through, and that will be noticed as a meeting of the BET through the Finance Department. So further details to come.
Roland, when that gets all settled and everybody's okay on different dates, whenever it is, can you make sure we just post that? We're not going to vote on anything, but that's a post that.
And it'll be similarly posted to
BET tour of MISA. Yeah, it's just a.
It will be we had very specific language last time, and I'll work with Roland on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can we cordially invite Greenhorn brand new selectmen to participate too?
We actually since he sat in our caucus tonight, which was a real pleasure. We actually did that already.
Okay.
And, but certainly, all three of the selectmen would be welcome.
Okay. New business. First item under new business is actually an item coming from several of us, but I want to take it further. We have an OPEB fund, our other post-employment benefit fund. As you know, we were the first municipality in the state to create a trust fund for that. That item funds retiree health care, MC employee health care. And when we created it, we took the items that we had for it, we put a large sum of cash in there, and we've been working it down. But it is a liability of the town, other post-employment benefits, and we do not have a policy on how we fund that. We've just never seemed to do that, and I think, as the media sometimes calls us the fiscal stewards, I think we should have a policy on that. So I'm going to ask the investment committee to draft a funding policy on that. Everybody should, if they have any ideas, chime in on that. I'd like, my goal would be to have that back to us within 2 months. And then once it's in rough form, we can have a discussion. We can send it to the Policy Procedure Committee so it's formatted like the rest of our policies. But I think that's something we'd have. I would really like to see that included in our submission to the RTM with the budget.
Mr. Drake, I just saved you 2 months. I've already written the policy. It's being reviewed by the actuary. I could have it to you next week. Okay. And it's only 4 pages long.
That's why I gave him a 30-day deadline.
Excuse me?
Sorry, did I slip there?
Thank you, Peter, for being ahead.
My goal was to, this might fit in a little bit with the February meetings. My goal was to write it and to have it ready for the OPEB presentations in February, because what's important is 7% versus 7.25%, fully fund the ARC versus not fully fund the ARC. So my goal was to have it for you in February, in which, at very least, it'll be ready.
Okay.
And it's important because it has budgetary impact both with the retirement actuary report, and again the same thing, 7 versus 7.25. You save 1.1 million, which you've already got in the budget, or another 1.6, and then OPEB. If you don't fully fund the ARC, there's money to be saved in the budgetary process as far as the contribution for OPEB. So it'll be ready for February.
Well, first of all, thank you. But that doesn't get Mr. Drake off the hook. This is very important. This is one of the last items that we've never really formally addressed. So I think it's a good measure for the town. So
and thank you. Our committee will undertake it. Thanks for sending it our way, and thank you, Peter, for being ahead on the timing of it.
Bill, if I may, when is your meeting in February? Do you know offhand? Because ideally you'd want to meet before we discuss it in the Budget Committee, which tentatively I've got it set for the 9th retirement.
The 9th is the actuary per contract is to come here and answer BET questions. And I sent the email to you and Michael. He asked me, he says, do you want a presentation? I think you get more value out of the actuary if you have a bunch of questions. You send them to me, I give them to the actuary, and he could base his presentation about what's important to you, what questions you have, as opposed to a basic, boilerplate presentation that he gives every year. So he's due here. It's either 9:30 or 10:30 on February 9th. And then the Budget Committee and the Investment Advisory will vote on the accepting the reports with the assumptions in them. As you know, the Retirement Board actuary report has already been approved by the Retirement Board at 7.0% interest rate assumption, discount rate.
So that when does that come before us?
It's ready. I wanted to bring them together because we like to keep the two assumptions.
So our February full board meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and we on the Investment Advisory Committee haven't calendared a meeting, but
No,
maybe
yeah.
what we're saying, the best thing is for us to really treat
Yes.
this item at the moment when the actuaries are here. Is February 9th is the date you're...
That's what I've got
Yes.
scheduled so far.
Yeah,
The
that
morning.
would seem to me to be fine.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman?
Their next meeting wasn't until April.
Okay, all right. So, okay, so this is in progress. All right, Mr. Gold, do you have a question?
Yeah, so this, my understanding is this OPEB calculation is not quite as simple as the pension fund. You've got to make a decision as to what the inflation rate will be for medical care. And I think that one was a big question out there, which hasn't been resolved. The other question was on workman's comp. What sort of growth in workman's comp claims we could expect, which is we've been treating that as an annual expense rather than something for which we could come up with a present value of the future. So, I mean, I'm kind of surprised that we could resolve those questions. I think we were looking at 10% in medical cost inflation, which seems to me way out of bounds, and how we come down on those, not just the portfolio return figure, but those other figures have a huge influence on our budgets. So I'm kind of surprised that our actuary has decided those all at this point.
But remember, we have a 5-year run on this, and plus some of those costs actually go away in certain labor contracts, right?
No, I mean, this is, if you have questions, you could send them to me now. We're still massaging that report. It's not finished. It's been kicked back maybe, 7 or 8 times in the last 2 months, maybe more. The team that we've put together over the years is, and you're alluding to the healthcare piece of it. I have Larry Simon and Allison Graham, and I have Roland working, and we've been going over that report since July, like 7 months, and we've kicked it back maybe a dozen times for questions like that. I really appreciate it if as quick as possible you could send me something in writing so that we get it in before the February 9th meeting. Because when you get it February 9th, you're getting a draft. It doesn't become official until the Budget Committee, the Investment Advisory Committee, and the BET vote on it.
Mr. Chairman.
So it's not a done deal.
And Pete, just on the date, on the 9th, I think we have a budget hearing. Is that right, Mark? And then on the 10th, we have a regular monthly Budget Committee meeting. Is that what everybody else has on their calendars?
Yeah,
Retirement and OPEB.
I think that's right.
So that's on Monday, the 9th, which is our day 3 of our budget hearings.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. So he's presenting to the IAC that day. Is that correct?
presenting to...
I didn't know that till right now, but he's coming in normally to the Budget Committee.
So
Yeah, what we had in mind was to kind of collapse the 2 meetings, or
Exactly.
kill 2 birds with 1 stone, since the actuary is presenting to the Budget Committee.
So during the budget hearings is what you're saying,
Right.
instead of at the Budget Committee meeting the next night?
You have an option. The February 9th is informational. He'll answer any questions. For example, if somebody sends a question and says, Greg Stump, what happens if we don't fully fund the ARC for OPEB? He'll answer that question. That's one of the questions he's going to answer. He says, what's the impact on what happens if we don't fully fund it? He'll answer that as a professional actuary. Any questions you have to educate yourselves on both, this is not only OPEB, this is just as important as the retirement actuary report, is going to be handled that day. You don't necessarily have to approve it on February 10th. You could approve it in March. What you have to approve in the month of February, and make up your minds in February for the March budgets, is what assumption rate are you going to use, which has a huge impact on the ARC. Because in the retirement board, you're locked in per charter to full 100% of what the actuary report tells you it is. On the OPEB report, you're not locked in yet unless you approve the OPEB policy in February. So you've got that option. You could say that we're going to effectively, in 2016, fully fund it at 100%. Impartially, I mean, just saying there's different options. Kind of
Right,
thing.
there's options.
So there's nothing definitive here as to the sequence of when people meet, when meetings are held, and when you actually have the vote on to accept the two reports.
So, if thinking out loud here, I mean, if we are meeting, our budget committee regular meeting is on Tuesday the 10th. It's my understanding Greg Stump is only going to be with us for that morning of the 9th, so that hopefully we'll all hear what we need to hear. If we need to talk more about it with Pete's help on the night of Tuesday the 10th, we can do that.
Come back. He's actually made special trips to attend the RTMs. I can't recall. It was a subcommittee it had to do with contracts. I can't remember which one, a year or two ago. He can, by contract, he owes us 2 meetings. One for the retirement board, and one for the OPEB. We can bring him back at $1,000 or minimal cost.
Let's hope that we get all our questions answered in that Monday the 9th.
Okay. So you understand the task here.
Thank you.
Which rules, I'm sorry, Ms. Tarkington?
I wanted to ask the question, will he be, it doesn't make any difference to me which meeting, but bringing that sort of interactive display? I know that one year, a couple years ago, he came and, we inserted the different rates and could see the impact. I found that, invaluable. I would hope that, whenever Mr. Johnson deems appropriate, that we could have that kind of presentation in one of those meetings.
He definitely could do that. He loves doing that.
I found it very helpful to think through the process.
You throw different assumptions at him, and he pushes a button on the screen. He tells you what the arc's going to be 5 years from now.
Right.
So,
all right, that's good. Which actually rolls us into the next item, is budget calendar. I put this on here just as a sort of a reminder, but I'll call on Mr. Johnson to sort of go through the outline here.
Well, so hopefully everyone has a copy. I emailed it this afternoon, but also Roland, I believe, had copies to spread out. This is a preliminary schedule. Is subject to change. Certainly, once we have the budget come out and I get a better feel for where certain areas might have more questions than others, I may adjust it a little bit. I also just received some information tonight at our caucus that Mr. Tessie, our first selectman, is going to be on vacation the week of the 9th, so I may move 1 or 2 items that way. But that's the reason why I'm calling this preliminary. I believe we probably want to get this out to the town department heads, right? Yes. Tomorrow. I may make a few changes, Roland, if I can, tonight. I'll get this to you tomorrow, especially with Peter Tessie's comments. But just to take you through this quickly, I have before us the full schedule from February 2nd through our full BET vote, which is March 19th. I've relabeled all the days to actually say day 1 through day 8. I found it was very difficult trying to approve the minutes, and I'm sure Kathy had some problems, like, what day was this, and, whatever, so I'm trying to streamline a little bit. But you can go through. The BOE, I sat with Ben Brannion, spent a good time with him. We kind of put together his agenda. I am assuming that our role is really budgetary, and I'm taking out some of the time that my predecessor had for talking about curriculum and a number of other things, which I don't think we as a BET really need to get into the details. So I've tried to streamline that a little bit. Sometimes in some of the days we have both operating and capital for the same department, and the example there is DPW. Jim Michael actually is going to be unavailable the next week, so I put DPW operating and capital together. And actually it's probably a little more efficient use of our department leaders being here at one time if possible. I'm having a little discussion now. We had a discussion earlier tonight about the land use agencies, given the recent change with the wetlands director. I certainly want to invite the board chairs there, and we've had a lot of interest in perhaps streamlining some of those departments. So, I'm still wrestling a little bit how to do that. But anyway, this is pretty much it. We do have to let the department heads know, roughly on their calendars to set aside the time. I do ask, as in our tradition in the last several years, that all BET members not on the Budget Committee to please submit comments or questions to your appropriate caucus colleagues. We do have 8 full days set aside. It's probably the most efficient way to run the meetings if the 4 members of the Budget Committee can be asking the questions. I will make an exception, for instance, with the retirement presentation. I mean, that's certainly something important that we all should be able to comment and ask questions on. But to Pete's earlier comment, great if you can get questions now to him ahead of time so the Greg Stump can prepare his presentation. So that's it. Certainly take a little more time looking at this. If you have any other thoughts or questions, email me like tomorrow before 10 o'clock so I can get this back to Roland. But again, it's subject to change as we see the need. So I would like to get this back to finance tomorrow afternoon.
Right. Well, I'd like to add a comment. This is the earliest that we've done this in the past. And the reason I'm doing this early is this gives everybody a chance, and I have something in my chairman's report also, but this gives everybody a chance to see what we're doing. Normally, this came out literally a few days before we started. And now it's out, so we know what departments, when we're doing capital, when we're doing operating, when we're doing lunch. But for that, it's very important, and I think this is a step at sort of making sure everybody has time for it to be involved and go from there. And I comment Peter's comment that he had before about get your ideas known so we can have these conversations. So, all right.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Is Mr. Johnson saying that only written questions will be taken and by the Budget Committee members, and the other 8 members will not have an opportunity to raise their hand and ask questions of the administration?
I don't think that's what he said. I think what he said is everything you have now, get it into him. And I think he also said on the pension, he wants that to be open to everybody for that presentation. So I think what he's trying to do is align his questions and his days up so everybody has a chance now to have an input. And I didn't hear him say that people weren't going to be able to speak. I didn't hear that.
Well, actually, I did kind of make reference that during the actual hearings themselves, I'd prefer to have the 4 members of the Budget Committee represent the full body by asking the questions and be involved with the hearings. I would really prefer that other BT members submit their questions or comments to their caucus colleagues as a way to make this more efficient. Even during the day, during the presentations, maybe you could, during the break, go up to one of your colleagues and say, hey, how about this or that? I think, we've got 8 days, and I'm trying to get it all covered within 8 days.
Well, I understand that. I will remark that I had a not the most pleasant experience with submitting written questions to your predecessor. I submitted many pages of them, and they were all ignored. So there has been a struggle over the last few years of being able to raise one's hand and ask relevant questions. And, I think that I understand time restraints, but we're all the Finance Board, and I find that questioning the administration on the various budgets is probably the most important thing that we do. And a lot of questions come up as the presentations are being made, as other questions are being asked. And I don't think it is actually the most efficient way to do it. If we were in Congress, and this was with the Agriculture Committee, and someone from Florida came and started asking questions, they wouldn't have the expertise, and I could understand that. Or someone on the Energy Committee, and it's basically people from Alaska and Oklahoma. But we're all doing the same thing. We all have similar experiences. It's one board. So I understand that according to charter, the Budget Committee formulates the budget. But in terms of questioning the administration, I think we should all have the opportunity to do that. Now, of those other 8, I probably am the one who tries to ask questions the most. Many others don't. But at least that opportunity should be there equally. We should not have to be restricted to submitting written questions. I don't think that's really efficient. I would suggest reconsidering that policy.
If I could make a comment on that, Mr. Chairman, I found in my experience last year that Mr. Johnson's handling of those questions from other board members was exemplary. He showed flexibility, and it was a system that actually worked. So I did not think that really very much extra time was taken as a result of permitting such questions. So it seemed to me that it was a more efficient way to handle things. So along with my colleague, Mr. Goldrick, I would urge Mr. Johnson to show the similar flexibility in this round.
I'll respond to that, and I'll consider that. Let's see how things go. I still would really prefer, questions going to one of the representatives of the Budget Committee ahead of time, but I'll take that under consideration.
Okay, so anybody who's got anything on this tonight, we want to get this posted. Okay, old business.
No, you have one more item to do.
I'm sorry, I'm on new business. Okay, that was budget calendar. The next item I'm going to call on, is it Mr. Drake, then Mr. Raymer, I would think. Mr. Drake.
Although I'm happy, Jeffrey, you want to?
No.
Okay. The topic is an investment by the Retirement Board of up to and including $10 million in Loomis Sales Strategic Alpha Trust. And the background of this is the Retirement Board previously had an investment in a PIMCO fund. PIMCO is a giant bond manager that has had a great deal of turmoil because their lead investor and star investor departed, and so the Retirement Board wished, like a lot of other investors, to no longer have a relationship with PIMCO. And so they elected to move a portion of the bond portfolio to a product in a similar style by Loomis Sales. So the point of this investment, it's a bond fund, which called in a category called unconstrained, which allows them to invest in not only governments but corporate bonds, bonds in other currencies, asset-based securities with different collaterals and bank loans. It's a very broadly based fixed income universe, and alpha in the name in effect means which in the investment buzzword is you're seeking for lack of correlation. So you're seeking for diversification within the sector. So within the bond category, the Retirement Board already has $64 million of investments in 4 separate Loomis Sales funds as of year-end 2014. So it's a money manager well known to the Retirement Board. The NEPC, the consultant to the Retirement Board, recommended that this fund is an appropriate way for the Retirement Board to enhance the return and diversification characteristics of the overall fixed income portfolio. So with the recommendation of NEPC and the unanimous approval of the Retirement Board, our committee considered this item with the help of Larry Simon on January 8th, and we voted 4-0 to ratify and approve their decision here. And that's what's in front of you. We, at the time, our view was that since this was already a fund family in which the town was previously an investor, that all the 4 of us plus Larry looked at it and said it didn't need to pass before the full BET, and if we find that it does, I'm happy to be corrected on that. But our committee was unanimously in favor of this investment.
Thank you. Law Committee report, Mr. Raymer.
And the Law Committee also looked at this. I'll separate out my own personal remarks to the separate discussion in a few moments. But just a report from the Law Committee. The Law Committee, by a vote of 2-0, found the documentation on this investment to be in legal order. We were assisted in the discussion by Mr. Simon, as well as, of course, by Assistant Town Attorney Eugene McLaughlin. Perhaps since it's a legal issue, although it was not a point that was discussed at the Law Committee, but perhaps just touching on the email that I sent to everyone, perhaps I should just reflect on the last comments by Mr. Drake. Just to mention publicly, as I did in the emails to you, that Section 208 of the Charter requires that the BET designate any corporate trustee to whom funds are being entrusted. And then separately, Section 208 also says that any agreement being entered into for such investments shall also be approved by the BET and also the town attorney. Yes, it's quite correct, of course. We already are invested in the Loomis Sales Fixed Income, the Loomis Sales Senior Loan Fund, the Loomis Sales Institutional High Income Fund, and the Loomis Sales Global Bond Funds. We've got lots of experience with Loomis Sales. Nevertheless, this fund is in the hands of a separate entity, a New Hampshire trust, which was created to operate this fund, and we're purchasing units in this fund. So it's a different entity than we contracted with before. The trustee also is a brand new entity, a limited liability company formed under the law of New Hampshire, unique to this particular fund. And we are being asked to sign a contract separate from our other contracts. So since I have a new corporation trustee, and since I have a new agreement, I'm sorry to exalt technicality over substance, but I think the proper procedure here would be for this board to vote to designate this corporation trustee and to approve also the agreement pursuant to which we're making the investment at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, discussion on the item. Mr. Raymer?
I weary you with my remarks each time this comes up, but I am constrained to do it each time. I don't have an alternative. My threshold of pain for high-risk, high-reward investments would have been at something like perhaps 10% of the portfolio. When it gets beyond 10%, certainly when it gets beyond 15% of the portfolio, I begin to become uncomfortable about whether or not we're meeting our stewardship responsibilities. I appreciate we also have a stewardship responsibility not to allow the return on our investments to dawdle either, but there's a value judgment implicit in that. Notice, if you would, from the flash report that Pete Mynarski had distributed, that the alternative investments are themselves at $67 million out of a total portfolio of $394, which is to say that we already have invested in alternative investments about 17% of the portfolio. And that figure is the amount that we've been able or obliged at this point to draw down into those investments. Most of those investments actually commit us to be investing a somewhat greater sum. The managers of the retirement board, our retirement board members, have already indicated to you that their target is to have about 25% of the portfolio in these non-investment grade alternative investments, which is the source of my nervousness. Notice also that this particular fund doesn't go into the alternatives. It's actually going to be part of the portfolio, which is called our total fixed income. You might have thought that the fixed incomes generally were intended to be a ballast that was to stabilize or to be the safe element. So notice that our high speculation, high reward investments aren't limited to the 17% already invested in alternative investments. It creeps along with this one into other categories. Leslie Tarkington said an interesting thing to me in a conversation I had with her recently. I'm sorry I didn't think of it myself, and I didn't ask Leslie if she'd mind my quoting her, but she said to me, gee, I don't know why we don't ask NEPC to grade these investments. To risk rate these investments. And I felt like an idiot that I hadn't thought of it, but that's exactly what's on my mind. I mean, I look at a portfolio, and because I'm not sophisticated at this, I don't know to what extent I'm looking at investments that would clearly have gotten, I don't know, a grade of A as opposed to a grade of D. I don't know if it's possible to ask NEPC to do this process of grading, but looking over at very cooperative Pete Mynarski over there, through Pete Mynarski, who sits on the retirement board, I'd be grateful if that could be explored with NEPC to see if that's a reasonable request. As to this particular investment, I asked both Larry Simon and Gene McLaughlin, not that it's either of their fields necessarily, gee, would you consider this particular investment, that is to say the Loomis Sales Strategic Alpha Trust, would you consider it itself to be an investment-grade security? And the answer I got from each of them separately was, after some thought and some doubt, no, I don't think I would. And I think that's not an unimportant observation by those people. Plucking at the documents before us to pick out the most troublesome language, I'm cherry-picking here for a moment. Well, surely this investment also will be investing in some investment-grade securities. Among the things that they say they intend or expect to be invested in are futures contracts, options on futures contracts, swaps, derivatives, leveraged investments. All of these are quotes from the documents themselves. The documents say, quote, that the investments will include instruments of relatively poor standing and have predominantly speculative characteristics. That's a quote. Another quote, bonds rated lower than investment grade. Another quote, a substantial portion of its assets will be in high-risk investments that are low-rated or unrated. I reflect to you my nervousness at the large profile of our investment that is in securities that are not investment-grade securities. I'm uncomfortable. I invite your discomfort too. As an entirely separate point, a much less important point, while I have very high regard for Loomis Sales, I do want to point out to you that with a fixed income fund at $21 million, the senior loan fund at $13 million, the institutional high income fund at $18 million, the global fund at $13 million, and now Strategic Alpha Trust at another $10 million, we will be invested $75 million in investments which are just in one family of funds. That's 19% of our total portfolio. Loomis Sales is a wonderful company, but there's quite as a separate matter, I have a mild hesitation about concentrating so much of our investment in one family of funds. I think it engenders a small measure of additional risk. All of this is just my personal viewpoint. I'm sorry to do this to you each time these things come up, but I feel constrained to say this, and I thank you for your patience.
Further discussion? Ms. Weisler?
Just 2 points. I know we are taking it up tonight, but I do think it is appropriate for us to take it up, even though this investment is part of the same family of funds. Certainly within a family of funds, it can be very different risk characteristics. So I think, and I understand from Mr. Drake's comments, it's a swap in terms of similar risk profile, but I think there's a difference in terms of liquidity of this versus perhaps what we were in previously. And second, I do plan to abstain tonight because I do feel I didn't have the opportunity, given that we got the documents today, to really look at it and be able to pursue questions because I didn't have the opportunity and time.
Further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll address one issue that Mr. Raymer just made. New England Pension Consultants are a consultant firm, and in my 30-plus years' experience in running other people's money, I have never encountered a consulting firm that will give you a quantitative or qualifiable determination of a risk.
Thank you. Further discussion? Ms. Tarkington?
I'd just like to add here, I think, again, as Jeff has pointed out, much of this discussion really wasn't as the law committee, and that we did, find the documents in legal order for the retirement board. But, Mr. Simon did discuss the concentration risk that Jeff has just mentioned with the Luma Sale investments, and he did add that this investment would be made in substitution for the core commodities and PIMCO investments, which I think we may have heard elsewhere. So, again, it's a risk. I believe this is the second private placement type of vehicle that we have with Luma Sales, and that did not come through in the analysis or discussions that we had within the law committee, and just I learned that today. I think that's the loan fund. So I do think that there are issues here. We keep talking about these issues at every month as we continue to make these investments, and yet I feel like we're not making progress. I know that there are 2 months, at least, in the public forum that I've asked in terms of certain investments that we get, additional information on all of our, alternative investments in terms of what amount of money that's been returned to us as dividends, as interest, and as capital can again be called. And I think that's critical in terms of computing these ratios. Nevertheless, this is not being put into the alternative investment portfolio, but rather into the fixed income portfolio. But I think that we really need to be observant of where this is headed. I will support this evening, but I do think these messages need to go back to the retirement board in terms of the portfolio and the quality of investments.
Okay, further discussion? Mr. Goldrick, Mr. Drake?
Yeah, I think we should know what sort of a fund this is. It can invest up to 50% in non-dollar currencies. It can go 100% long or 100% short. It can invest up to 20% in emerging markets currencies, up to 50% in junk bonds. And oddly, the benchmark is LIBOR, which I told my colleagues is kind of like having the Olympic high jump competition and putting the bar 6 inches off the ground. I mean, who can't meet LIBOR? That doesn't make any sense. The pension fund, the retirement board got burned with an emerging markets bond fund in the past. They thought they were investing in bonds which were denominated in U.S. dollars, but just like here, 20% was in local emerging markets currencies. They lost on that. Let me keep in mind that the pension fund, the retirement board can't seem to figure out whether it should have a passive investment strategy or an active. About half of this portfolio is indexed, and the other half is in really dodgy instruments like this. As I said to the caucus, we are a smallish municipal pension fund. We're not supposed to be playing games. And even though it's not that big a percentage, going into junk bonds and emerging markets currencies in a bond fund which charges us 46 basis points, which is very expensive, and which has an expense ratio of 86 basis points, which is also very high, doesn't make any sense. And we're responsible for this. We vote on this. So it's not a matter of just saying, well, wish they'd do another job or, put it in something else. At some point, this is going to blow up, and we're on the hook. So I'm going to recommend that we turn this down, and there's really no justification for approving this.
Mr. Drake?
To respond to a couple of things. This is not an alternative.
No, it's being classified as a fixed income.
Yeah, because it's fixed income.
Risk.
No, it's not. It's among our list of Luma Sales funds, this one would be lower risk than the institutional high income fund that we have $17 million in. So in the range of bond risks alone.
You're scaring me more.
No, it's certainly not an alternative. You referred to it as in the category of alternatives. It's not in that category. I take Leslie makes a point about our on our alternative side, what we've put out and come back. That's a good point. Let's talk about it. It has nothing to do with this, right? Nothing to do with this. Right. And so this, to call this as dodgy, this is not dodgy. This is a lower risk bond portfolio. Their target rate of return, like Mr. Goldrick has said, is LIBOR plus 2 to 4. Well, if LIBOR plus 2 is 2 plus 2 is around 4, if your goal is to make 4, you're not in the risk. It's not necessary to take any risk, and they don't take a high risk. That is not the objective of this fund. It's these things can't be looked at. Return can't be looked at independent of risk. This is a low return objective fund, and the risk is commensurate. This is not a high risk fund. So I'd just like to respond. This is, as to its liquidity, when you go into a private equity deal and you buy a piece of some leveraged buyout company, your money is stuck for 7 years. This you can get out every 15 days. So it's a completely different animal. So I wouldn't want our board to think about this as an alternative. It's not. Or as a high-risk bond fund. It's not. Or that it's illiquid. It's not. And it's for that reason that the pension consultants and retirement board and our committee all thought it was appropriate here. Let's just look clearly at what it is we're voting for.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yeah, so I do want to come back and add, there was some certain documentation that came out today in response to some questions we had in the law committee meeting, and that is the New Hampshire, that it's the New Hampshire Trust. Quite frankly, at the meeting, I asked, Attorney McLaughlin and Wayne Fox, others. I've since asked other people that, I thought might be knowledgeable in New Hampshire trust laws. Quite frankly, in my decades of work experience, this is the first time I have seen this. It appears to be a related vehicle in the information we get. I found the structure interesting, but again, it is a different kind of flag being raised, and I think we just have to add and note these issues because they are beginning to compound and add on to each other.
Okay. Further discussion on the item? Mr. Goldrick?
Just a quick notion. Mr. Drake is correct that this is not an alternative investment vehicle. It's not a hedge fund or private investment vehicle. But I have to take issue with the characterization of being a safe investment or, 20% in emerging markets currencies, 100% long or short, 50% in below investment grade, and it's a very high cost, 46 basis points, where you can get normal bond funds for 4 or 5 now, and their upside is between 2 and 4% over LIBOR, so 2.4 to 4.4%, and this is the risk they're taking. I don't think we should be having anything to do with this.
Okay. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
So I'm going to put that down as nope, and all those abstaining. So I'm going to put that as 9-2-1. That item has been approved. I'm sorry, Ms. Weisler. Okay, item 11 has already been disposed of earlier. Item 12, BET regular minutes for December 15th. Do I have a motion?
I would move they be approved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? Mr. Drake, do you have anything?
No, Mr. Chairman, I don't.
Mr. Norton?
No, Mr. Chairman.
I have a few things. In our BET family, our treasurer, Kathleen Murphy, has recently lost her sister, and I would like to reach out through the controller to Kathleen with our condolences, and we're very, very sorry. That was just this week, and they were twin sisters. I didn't know that they were twins, and so very, very sad from the BET. Please send our condolences. Nick, our next regular full BET meeting is the Tuesday after President's Day, and I do have a request for moving that meeting by a day or so. So I'll put out an email feeler. I'll be looking for an email feeler on that. And in normal fashion, as I think I said last month, we're about to start the budget process, and we spend a little bit of time together. And we touched on it earlier. You'll notice I put in your package this month sort of my favorite starting place for all budgets. And it's called the Capital Appropriation Statement. And for those of you who are not familiar with it or don't see it as often as I might, you should check in with Roland and Peter and sort of learn how to read it when the project started, where it is, what's committed, what's been spent. But I think this is one of the original starting points for the budget. I think it's very important. So I just dropped that in the package just so everybody can start reviewing that. It's a lot of pages. It's got to be 10, 12 pages long. I think you'll see some trends. I think you'll see some areas where there's been an enormous amount of appropriation, but things haven't begun. I think you'll see some of the dates. But for reference point, I think it's very important. So I wanted to include that. And other than that, a lot of meetings in attendance. I've attended the Board of Ed meeting this last month. I've started to get back on the sort of the proverbial saddle to going to different meetings. I encourage everyone to, the RTM doesn't meet in February, but starting in March, we should start trying to reach out and get the feedback for their questions. I know Mark is working with some of the committee chairs. But other than that, hopefully it's not snowing out tonight. The town was lucky and got through that ice storm on Sunday morning, so hopefully we're not going to go outside to one of those tonight. With that, watch out for Saturday. Mr. Blankley. Ms. Weisler.
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Good evening.